because I'm going to now into the presentation. So as you can see, we have all very clear ideas about teaching and learning. I mean, we have all taught for a while. We have learned, we've been learners since a very, very long time. So we know, we have a gut feel about what good learning is, when we learn well, and also when our students learn well. But often what I find, especially lecturers who are not necessarily in education, lack the vocabulary, the terminology to frame what they feel in their guts with the right words. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you the kind of terminology, the words, to what you already know in some ways. So I hope it helps when you later on in your conversations about teaching and learning to know what is the vocabulary for the kind of thing that you already know. So see, if you talk about theories of teaching and learning, there are many. There are hundreds of different teaching and learning theories. And it's always difficult to kind of categorize, because when I'm thinking I have maybe half an hour now to present to you, how am I going to summarize everything that's out there? More than 150 years, most probably. Dewey started writing about teaching and learning in the 1915s, 1920s. So how do you summarize what has happened over the last 120 years in 30 minutes? And what I find very useful is a paper that's quite dated. It was written in 2011 by Terry Anderson and John Dron, who write a lot about distance education. But they have tried to make sense within distance education on how the thinking about teaching and learning has changed over time. And they have identified what they call 3 generations of distance education pedagogy. And although they are framed or they are embedded in distance education, it is very applicable to blended learning, to our institutions as well. So they broadly categorize teaching and learning theory, or as they call it, pedagogies, into 3 phases. So the starting point was cognitive behaviorist theories of teaching and learning, then the social constructivist pedagogies or theories of learning, and finally connectivist pedagogies or teaching and learning theories. I will add another one at the end that I call the more critical pedagogy or critical theories on teaching and learning, which they do not cover as such. So the first one that they kind of identified, the first wave or generation of theory, all focus around cognitive or behaviorist pedagogies. And I think we all know that carrot picture, the stick or the carrot. That is what is kind of central to these kind of teaching and learning theories. They're not so much interested in, what's going on inside a person or how social learning happens. They're really interested in how behaviors can be acquired, or new behavior and behavioral change can be done. And it's all in this kind of theoretical framing, it's all about an individual. So it's all about an individual's response to external stimuli. So they're not so interested in internal motivation. It's all about what comes from the outside. Is it pleasurable or is it painful? And that's how we learn. That was the kind of core belief in that area, or in that space of thinking about teaching and learning. And that school of thought is very much centered around psychologists like Edward Watson, John Thorndike, Skinner, who did all those experiments with mice and monkeys and how to change behavior. Later on, people moved from pure behaviorists to more cognitive learning theories, where they are starting to be interested in what's going on in your brain, in your mind, and they've linked it a lot to the computational module. So they're thinking about, okay, I put something into your head, something happens in your head, and something comes out again. But again, all of these are very much focused on the individual, on the behavior, on what I can observe. What is the observable behavioral change in response to certain conditioning and to certain stimuli. And what's important in here is feedback, positive and negative feedback, because that's how people learn. Reinforcement, so repetition. The more often you learn something, the better you remember, and it eventually becomes automatic. But it ignores everything that's non-observable, everything that happens inside yourself. In some ways, here the learner is a tabula rasa. It's an empty vessel, and you put something in and something comes out. So behaviorism was the first big theory around that. Later on, cognitivism, where they have some sort of relevance of what's happening in the mind, and they start thinking about how do you have to connect to previous knowledge and previous information that you learn. So it's all about kind of structuring, learning content from easy to more difficult, organizing information so it's easy for people to relate. But it's very much teacher-centered. The teacher's in control over the learning process. They design the learning process, and the learner assimilates what the teacher offers to them. So very much focus on individual learner. The locus of control is in the teacher, the instructional designer who creates these course designs. It's very structured. Interests are stimulated. The importance is, can I recall? Can I remember? Can behavior be automated? So very important. Learning objectives become very important, because that's how you assess then the outcome towards the learning objectives. And this was really attractive in the early computer-based training, the drill and practice modules. The more often you did it, the better you remembered. Any questions so far? Does it make sense? Give me a thumbs up if you're all still on board. Thumbs up? Have I lost you? Okay, cool. Perfect. Glad. It's very awkward because I'm talking basically in the void, into, absolute silence. So it's always nice to get a quick feedback that people are still here and still on the page. Cool. So this is very much distance education generation 1. So if you think UNISA, it was all about providing access, widening access. So it had to be a very generic, very standardized way of, curriculum, course design to reach a lot of people. So the kind of technology that was available at that time was maybe video conferencing, where you deliver the lecture across the country, but very much still paper-based. People got these study guides, they were delivered to their houses on their own, they went through the curriculum, they came for assessments, and that was basically what distance education or blended learning looked like. So very much a one-to-many communication. So from the lecturer to thousands and more students. And, often packaged as computer-based training, drill and practice, as I've said before. Let me move to the next slide. So this is to make sense how that would apply in today's day and age, because we still have a lot of, although it sounds a bit old-fashioned, we still have a lot of courses that are following that kind of course design. I have been involved in a paper or in a conversation really with 2 colleagues of mine, Maha Bali from Egypt, from the American University in Cairo, and Nicola Palit, who works in Rhodes. And we have started to talk about our different online staff development course designs, because we got into, so we thought a lot last year about how we would deliver academic staff development that's traditionally very much face-to-face and workshop-based and with a lot of interaction, a lot of conversations. How can we translate that into an online space? So in our conversations, we kind of thought about different design dimensions that we would look at when we design a blended learning course. And these are the kind of dimensions that we came up. So one is about openness and closeness. So how closed is your course, or how open is it to the public? So is it behind the learning management system? Are people being registered into a course that would be a closed format? Is it facilitated or unfacilitated? Is it very structured or more like unstructured and people can find their own way through? Is it certified, uncertified? Does it have very clear date commitments when assignments are due, or is it more open and people can, choose their own time to do these assignments? Is it a homogeneous learning path? Do we take everyone through the same path, or can people find their own learning path through the course? Is it very content-centric or more identity or process-centric? So is it more about your reflecting on your own practice? Is it quite serious with, assignments and essays, or is it more playful and more, experimentational? And is it more individual or more collaborative learning? So the cognitive behaviorist pedagogies will all be on the left side of the spectrum. So for example, the course we offered last year, I don't know if some of you were part of that, the first module on theory of curriculum design, the way we had structured that one was very much a cognitive or behavioral method. We had screencasts, so it was very structured. We prepared content, and people week by week were expected to listen to these podcasts, to read some articles, and then to apply the content that they learned into their own curriculum development. We had a design activity template, but there was not much consideration about social learning, about bringing people together like now in a webinar so they can interact and they can exchange thoughts. It was very much a structured, content-driven. The lecturer decided the course design and the pacing and the activities, and very much an individual process. So I would frame or define that course design as very much behavioral cognitivist. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? Are you still okay? Thumbs up. Anybody wants to say something so far? Any comment? I've been talking a lot. Anybody want to take the mic and say something? You're all fine. By the way, welcome, Nasli. I'm glad you made it. Yeah, so shall I just move on? So the next big theory or teaching and learning theory wave, that came then after this more behavioral or cognitive framing was a social constructivist teaching and learning school of thoughts. So they moved away from this idea that the learners are an empty slate, and there's nothing they can draw from, and we just provide stimuli, and then learners respond to these stimuli and learn. And they are very much about, and these are now people like Piaget and Dewey and Vygotsky that all say that learning is a social activity. You don't learn by yourself. Learning is all about constructing your own meaning based on your context, based on previous experiences, and based on the people around you with whom you either model, or you engage with, or you discuss, or you scaffold. So learning is active. Learning is an active process. Knowledge is being constructed, and learning is social. Those are the main features of social constructivism. And again, there are many different theories that are being linked to these school of thoughts, like constructivism itself, who says that learning is an active constructive process. The learner is not viewed just a recipient who, computes information and data in their minds, but they actually actively construct knowledge. And it's self-regulated, the learning, and I have to build my own conceptual structure so that I can make sense of what I'm learning. And it all depends on my own subjective interpretation of reality. It depends on my experiences. It depends on how I can link the new knowledge with old knowledge. And my emotional, my affective engagement with this knowledge. Is it something that I respond positively to? Is it something that I'm scared of, and that's why I don't want to touch? So it's all about who the learner is. And that also means that each learning path will look different. And it's all about situatedness and the context of the learner. And it's messy and complex. It's not just linear. So then social constructivism added the whole idea of that we learn in a social in a group, in a community. We learn by observing, by working together. So the teacher becomes a facilitator to facilitate learning rather than to teach. And Vygotsky, you know, speaks about scaffolding and the zone of proximal development. So Vygotsky would argue that there's only so much I can learn by myself. And then there's the zone of proximal development where I basically learn a little bit more with the help of somebody who knows a little bit more than I do. So there's a certain gap between what I can achieve and what I can achieve with the help of others. Kolbe's experiential learning would also fall here into social constructivism. So this idea that I have an experience, I have something that I have, you know, that happens to me, whether I go into work integrated learning or I have teaching practice, something happens. And then from that experience, by reflecting and by reading, by theorizing the experience, learning happens. New knowledge is being constructed. And finally, there is authentic learning, also very similar to what we have spoken about. So Jan Harrington, she would argue that what good learning would be is if you recreated the disciplinary practice in the classroom. So if you created a classroom space that's as closely related to the disciplinary context that the students would go out into. So you kind of provide authentic context that reflect the way knowledge will be used in real life. You create authentic assessments, authentic tasks that are as closely related to the real life as possible. And it's all about understanding that knowledge construction is messy and complex, and you need multiple roles and perspective. You always work in groups. It's always about collaborating. It's about reflecting. It's about being able to articulate what you learned and to present to others. And the facilitator becomes a coach and scaffolds learning for the learners at critical moments. I'm going very quickly, I understand, but I hope you get the gist. For me, it's more to understand the principles of each of these big generations of learning theories. So the kind of tools and technologies in distance education that were used then in this generation, it was at the same time, it was the advent of, you know, two-way communication, email, internet, discussion forums. So suddenly learners could actually engage with each other rather than just with, you know, their study guides. So the locus of control moved from the teacher to the learner, and peer learning became much more important. And the importance of modeling, of imitation, of dialogic inquiry. It also becomes more expensive because now you suddenly need more people to facilitate all that learning. And in some form, it also limits access. So you can't be as wide as in the one-to-many communications. And it limits scalability if you want to facilitate those kinds of conversation among learners. But learning management systems helped massively with this kind of learning, you know, with discussion forums and emails and chats that allow students to now engage with each other. So in terms of our own model, social constructivist pedagogies would stay somewhere in between the left and the right side. So there would be some facilitation, but it's not as structured. And it's definitely a lot more driven by the learner and a lot more emphasis on on process and constructing meaning with others than the left-hand side. So a combination of individual and collaborative learning. Does that make sense so far? Any questions? Are you all still there? Cool. So our course now, the second iteration of the course, as we are offering it now, is much more social constructivist than maybe the first module that we offered. Because of these webinars that we are offering on a weekly basis, we're trying to create this kind of community inquiry. We are trying to create more communication, more interaction, more engagement, and it is much more process-oriented. All the activities that we are asking you to do are about constructing, linking your own experiences, who you are, your practice, where you're embedded in, with the theory and the reading. So it's a lot more focused on collective, collaborative construction of meaning, and very much situated in our practice, in our discipline, in our space. Finally, the last big wave, as per Anderson and John, is connectivist theories of teaching and learning. And that is really something that has emerged in the last, I would say, 10, 15 years, most notably in the work around MOOCs. George Siemens and Stephen Downes, both in distance education in Canada, who started thinking about how learning happens when it's massive. I don't know how many of you have ever done a MOOC, but these MOOCs, these massive open online courses, have thousands and thousands of students that enroll and that kind of make their own way through the learning. So it's not so much about content anymore in connectivism, but the idea is that really what we need to learn, the content is all out there. It's not about acquiring content. It's more about understanding how to access this content, what to do with the content, how to build networks of information and contacts and resources that I can apply to real world problems. So people talk about network learning in this generation of distance learning, which is really where we emphasize relationships and collaboration rather than technology. It promotes very much openness in attitude, but also in openness in access to resources, learner collaboration, self-directed learning, authentic learning. So a little bit very similar to the social constructivism, but much more self-regulated. So rather than offering clear structured learning paths, offer people, let people be guided by their own passion and interest. It's very much around this idea of developing lifelong learning skills, the fourth industrial revolution. We have heard that so many times. But how do you develop these skills? How do you prepare our students if you know that, I don't know, I've heard, is it 85% of all the knowledge they're acquiring now will be obsolete in 5 or 10 years? So how do we prepare our students for a situation where they have to constantly just keep learning, keep updating their knowledge, knowing where to tap into to get the most up-to-date knowledge? And that's often in big networks such as Twitter, by following the people who are pushing the boundaries in your discipline. And that's how you will hear first about new knowledge. And to build and maintain this network, so you have beyond your institution, beyond your country, to be able to flexibly and stay up to, to the state of the knowledge. And the information is there and it's plentiful. And learners their role is not to memorize or even understand everything, but to know where to find the information, and also to know who to talk to engage about this information to make meaning. So beyond knowledge, it's also about who do you connect with. And some of the teaching and learning theories that are connected to connectivism is pedagogy, for example, where it's all about your own learning, self-directed, self-determined learning. I think the Faculty of Informatics and Design has offered this or introduced the Teach Yourself Tuesday, where students get a whole day where there are no classes and they're expected to teach themselves whatever they need to know or whatever they are interested in. Connectivism, George Siemens is one of the main proponents of this theory. I think I have covered most of this. But the idea really that learning is a self-organizing process. It's chaos out there, and I have to find my way through these networks and this chaos and this complex pool of data. These are just some principles that connectivism is based on. And as an example, the kind of tools used is, social media, Twitter, the internet, MOOCs, blogging, all of those tools are ways of connecting with people out there. And this is really then, in our model, connectivism would sit on the right end of the spectrum, where learning is open. Like instead of Blackboard, we are using Google Sites for this course because I can invite people from all over the world if I wanted to into this course. It's unfacilitated. It's, you're being given topics or themes and you can choose what you're interested in, and you dip in and you dip out depending on where your interest lies. It's often uncertified. It's often with no date commitments. You find your own way. You find your own autonomous learning path. So each learning path will look different. It's very process-centric. So it's very much about reflecting who you are and what you're doing and your own practice rather than content-driven. It's very playful. Lots of experimentation, lots of activities that come from game-based learning and that are not typical academic activities. And it's very collaborative. So this is an example of connectivist learning. It's Mahabali's Equity Unbound. It's an online course that she runs with two colleagues of hers every year, and they each teach a class of undergraduate students around digital literacies in Egypt. Catherine Cornyn is based in Ireland, and Mia Zamora in the US. So they have kind of synchronized their teaching. So they each have a group of students that they teach, but then they have this online course that kind of combines or brings them all together. And so they have set up these online activities, all open on Twitter. Some of the activities you might encounter in this course, we have kind of drawn a lot from her experiences. But it's open, and the open platform is unfacilitated. So you join in, you use a hashtag, you put your reflections out there, people will connect to you. You don't know from where, but there's a network of learners that's being established through things like hashtags on Twitter that are not in one institution. They're not part of one course, but they connect differently through these social media networks. So these are just some of the activities that they do, and it happens a lot through hashtags, through Twitter, through blogging, through connecting. But any MOOC you're taking would be some sort of connectivist learning. So this is just a summary of, they call it education 1, 2, 3, but I think one could replace, the more behavioral, cognitive approaches, social constructivism, and connectivism. And it's kind of just summarizes how these approaches have changed over the years. Are there any questions so far? Where would you place yourself? Where do you think you sit with your practice? Where would you place yourself in this continuum? Who wants to take them up? Please raise your hand and let me know. Get some feedback from you. Where would you place yourself on the continuum? I can see Pam is typing. See, people are typing. Sometimes it's too much. I'm sorry. That's true. I think what's really important for us as well is to say that none of these, if you look at this module that we have set up, I'm just looking for it. it was really interesting because one of the things you said, there's no one that's better than others. So it really depends on your context, on your students, on your outcomes, on the way you teach and learn, and your students teach and learn, where on this spectrum you're sitting. But I think it's a really interesting exercise to place yourself here and to see where you are sitting and maybe in which direction you'd like to move, even if it's just a little bit. But I think it's really important to say that none of these models are better than the other, but they suit specific contexts, specific disciplines, specific students, and as Pam says, you know, for some, even in one course, you can have more areas that are more experiential and more social or constructivist, and others that are more instructivist and cognitive and behavioral. Thanks, Nasli. Yeah, experiential learning is a big component of the practical module. Correct. Yes. So one of the theories that I'd like to add, and that Sia is going to talk a lot more next week, is what they don't have at all is the more critical theory. So the critical pedagogy, decolonization, something that has come up over the last few years really strongly. And that's all about, you know, this idea that education is always political and it's not apolitical or neutral. So the way we teach, we also position ourselves on a political spectrum. And that actually what we need to look at is the kind of systems that are being set up and that were set up, and how they still persist and how they still impact on who teaches, who learns, how we teach, what we believe important, or, you know, the the powerful knowledge, what knowledges are powerful and less powerful, so which knowledges are being foregrounded, which are being alienated or othered. So how does power operate in an institution and in a teaching and learning space? And it's all about subjectivity and positionality, and about asking yourself who is teaching, who is learning, what is being taught, where are we teaching, looking at space, and you know, challenging everything that we are doing and trying to rethink about who and what does this education serve, who is included and who is excluded. And I don't want to go into too much depth, because Sia is going to talk a lot about this next week when he talks about graduate attributes and the kind of students that we want to develop, or we want to work with in our courses. So that will come next week quite strongly. So I have finished my presentation. If anybody wants to say something, otherwise I'll just close up and I'll just talk about what's happening after this webinar. Is there anybody who wants to say something? Any feedback and any comments about today? Anything that you found interesting or challenging, or that you'd like to know more about? Raise your hand, please. Don't feel shy. Nasli, do you have a mic, or you prefer typing? Okay, it's new, huh? Any final comments by anybody? So the second activity this week, and it is on your Google site, will be to look at the article that I've shared with you, which was the foundation of my presentation today, and to just reflect back on your own, you know, teaching and learning practice, and which theories does this teaching and learning practice reflect best, and why? And do you think it's still appropriate for the discipline, for what you are teaching, and for the students that you teach? And is there any of the theoretical approaches on that on that continuum from cognitive behavioral to social constructivism to connectivism, where would you like to move to and how would you go about that? So I would really like you to think about that, as Pam says, to let things settle and to reflect and to add your reflection into the working document under activity 2. And please add your name so we know who wrote what. And I'm really looking forward to more engagement. Can I just, before we all check out, can you just give me one word? You can put it in the chat. How do you feel right now after this session? Do you feel excited? Do you feel overwhelmed? Do you feel scared? Give me one word as a checkout. Okay. What needing? Okay. But how do you feel, Pam? We all need more time to read, but how do you feel right now? Hot. Okay. Sorry. Oh. Overwhelmed. Sorry, Natalie. I hope it gets easier with the next webinar when you're more used to the technology. Okay. Thanks, Mavi. Glad you're liking it. It is a lot. If you've never done a webinar before, I'm sure it's a lot to take in. Cool. Anybody, Sunwabo, Donna, you want to give us your feedback? Tony, are you still there? Some people. Yeah, Tony said very bad. I don't know. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for joining. And so then I'll see you next Wednesday at the same time. So next Wednesday's here will take you through a session about graduate attributes and how these theories inform graduate attributes. And then the next session will talk about blended learning and how all of this link to how we define blended learning. And that will be done by Faik. So I'm really looking forward to seeing you over the next few weeks. And there are lots of resources on our site. I don't know if you've had time to go through and browse through our site, but there are lots of articles if you want to read more. I will put the recording. I'm actually going to